We are used to thinking of the mind as made up of different things, different faculties, different processes, different abilities. It might sound a bit abstract or maybe even a bit dull to ask, how do we make those divisions? How do we chop them up into different processes? But actually, my view is, once you get clear on how that works, you'd be amazed how many problems in philosophy and in psychology now there's new perspectives on them, there's new ways of thinking about them, and you get something really like a theoretical result.
All right, so welcome everyone to today's interview. We're very pleased to welcome Professor Henry Taylor. He is associate professor at the University of Birmingham in the UK, and his work is focused on various issues in metaphysics, mind, cultural robotics, and other things. He also has various published articles on these topics and more. And his recent book is Natural Kinds and the Science of Perception, which is going to be our focus for today. But yeah, feel free to add anything. But with that, welcome in. Thanks so much for being here, Professor Taylor.
Thanks, Troy. Thanks very much for having me.
Awesome. So yeah, so as I said in the introduction, we're going to focus on your recent book, Natural Kinds and the Science of Perception, and I'll include links where people can find that. Nice. And so just as a start, can you give a bit of an introduction to natural kinds in general? Like what are philosophers talking about when we're talking about natural kinds?
Yeah, so the term natural kinds in philosophy is kind of a bit infamous, quite notorious for being used in lots and lots of different ways. It's quite difficult to work out what people are talking about. But at the core, so my book is about natural kinds in psychology. And at its core, what that's interested in is imagine a human mind. So you've got a mind, and psychologists, neuroscientists, and philosophers are very fond of saying, well, the mind is broken up into a load of different things which do different stuff. So, here's one thing is vision. Here's another, smell. Here's another, the ability to hear. Then there's also memory. And there's, 5, 10, 15 different kinds of memory. And all these, there's cognitive abilities, the ability to think, the ability to reason, the spatial navigation, pretty much everything that goes on in the mind. People have said, well, they've sort of broken them up and categorized them into different aspects. Now, the core question of a natural kinds approach is, what is it that makes those categories? So what is it that makes the various terms, what is it makes them latch onto real parts of the mind? So, for example, if I said, if I talked about something like long-term memory, that's one kind of category. That's latching onto something real in the mind that really does exist, which is long-term memory. And whereas by contrast, if I were to talk about, so if I were to make up a category like, imagine I tried to talk about the category of things that are either the smell of bread or the visual experience of a ball, you would say, well, that feels sort of made up. That's not a real. There is the smell of bread. You can smell bread, and there is a visual experience of a ball. You can see balls, yeah. But this category, this way of sort of taxonomizing the mind, that includes a category like, well, the smell, all the things that are smells of bread, and all the things that are visual experiences of balls, and nothing else. That feels somehow a bit more made up. That doesn't feel real. It feels like some of the terms we use, basically the idea at its core is some of the terms we use to talk about the mind, like vision or hearing or memory or thought or cognition, all of those things, they feel somehow real, like those are real, actual faculties possessed by the mind. Whereas other ways we could talk, just don't feel real in the same way. Natural kinds theory is meant to be a way of explaining how you come up with those categories, what counts as a good category, what counts as a bad one, how you resolve disagreements about how the mind should be carved up. And in that way, it kind of goes, it's at the core of all psychology and all neuroscience. because both of those scientific research disciplines have to categorize the mind in some way, and the question of natural kinds is what's a good category and what's a bad one broadly. That's the idea.
Great, great. Yeah, and as you say in this book, you focus on the mind and perception, and more specifically. And I was just kind of wondering, why do you focus on perception and neuroscience in particular in this book? After all, there's a lot of different mental or conscious kinds that we might focus on, or other kinds, and more broadly than that. So yeah, I was just wondering, why is that the focus in this book?
There's a sort of boring answer and then an interesting answer. So the boring answer is just that's perception is what I already know about. So my PhD was on attention, and it was on the relationship between attention and consciousness. And a lot of my work since then has been on attention, especially in perception. But the sort of more interesting reason that there was the main motivating factor was that there's a really strong upsurge at the moment of philosophers who are really interested in merging the philosophy of perception with perceptual psychology. So these philosophers are often interested in what perception is, but they're typically interested in consciousness as well, and the difference between the conscious and the unconscious. So it's a particularly fertile, this movement of integrating the perceptual psychology with philosophy really, really tightly it makes it a very fertile area for research at the moment, because there's a lot of overlap. So there's a lot of papers which could just as easily be in a philosophy journal or a psychology journal, and around the edges of sort of perceptual psychology and neuroscience with philosophy, it really can be quite difficult to see what the difference is. In fact, some philosophers have argued that there isn't a difference. There's just trying to find stuff out. That's the overall aim. And some of it's really theoretical. That's the philosophy side. Some of it's much more applied. That's the psychology side. In the middle, who cares? It doesn't matter what you call it. And that's very much the view that I would have. So it's kind of a really fertile area. And there's lots of puzzles in those areas, which I think natural kinds can really help with, which is what the book was kind of trying to do.
Yeah, fair enough. I was sort of wondering, and this is not something I think you talk a lot about in the book, but to what degree do you think that more general issues in the philosophy of mind are relevant here? So, like, does it make much of a difference if, say, the mental states or processes are something in the head, more or less, or is that kind of tangential? What do you think about that?
Oh, that's a really, really interesting question. No, it makes a really big difference. So I assume you're thinking about the externalism debate.
So that partly, but also just, I guess, like whether consciousness or mental states are something broadly physical. Yeah. So, but I guess I'm thinking of both. Maybe I should have separated them. But yeah, part of it is
no. That's good. Yeah, I mean, it matters a lot. Is the short answer. Yeah. So I'll take the externalism and the physicalism question. So broadly, externalism is the view that your cognitive processes aren't confined to your head. They rely on the world around you in some really important way. Now, what's interesting about that is there are two different views you might have of what a cognitive process like thought is. So what if someone said something like, well, what is thought? There's two different views you might give, which are someone might say, well, it's stuff going on in the brain, and they might give a really complicated explanation of what that is. Another person might say, it's stuff going on in the brain when that stuff is coupled in the appropriate way to the external environment. Now, at its core, questions like what is thought are questions about categorization. They're questions about what do we mean by thought? What does thought actually consist in? What is actually out there in the mind? And they are kindhood questions. They are questions about how we categorize the mind, things like that. So, there are some people who think that the correct way of making up mental categories is we pick them out in virtue not just of the brain or the head. You pick them out in terms of the environment as well. That's a really interesting question about how you categorize mental states. So it does make a difference in that sense. That's one of the main, and one of the things that's really interesting about that is, of course, that neuroscience doesn't do that. That's not how neuroscience carves up the mind. Neuroscience is what it sounds like. It's brain focused. It's quite, a philosopher would say, it's quite internalistic. It's not. It is interested, of course, in how we engage with the world, but that's not how it picks out mental states. So all these issues are thrown into a different perspective. If you think that mental states actually extend out into the world, then presumably you think that either the neuroscientists are missing something by only talking about the mind when they're only talking about the brain when they talk about these mental states. Either they're missing something, or somehow the neuroscientists might be correct. It is to talk about brain stuff. It's just that the kinds they're talking about are actually quite different from what we're talking about when we use words like thought. So I think it matters a lot. With regard to I tried to stay away from the question of physicalism versus dualism. I have written a fair bit about physicalism and dualism. I was quite desperate to make the book appeal to as many people as I possibly could. So I didn't want to say, you're only allowed to read this book if you're a dualist, or you're only allowed to read it if you're a physicalist. I do think it makes a big difference, though, because, of course, it makes quite a big difference to what the mind actually is made of. The book is all about how different parts of the mind interact with each other, and it's all about drawing boundaries between different faculties in the mind. Presumably, say you're a physicalist and you think the mind is just bits of the brain, fair enough. Presumably, that's going to make a really big difference to how you think you draw boundaries around the different mental states. What's the difference between perception and consciousness and thought, for example? Well, if you're a physicalist, presumably you think whatever that difference is going to show up somewhere in the brain. There's going to be some different brain areas that are responsible for it. For a dualist, someone who thinks that the mind is a non-physical thing, I don't know. I mean, they certainly can say that the difference between different mental states, those important borders, they certainly can say that is mirrored by differences in the brain. But it feels like somehow they're not kind of forced into it in the way the physicalist is. A physicalist who makes a very strong version of physicalism, where it just says all mental states are identical with brain stuff, that really constrains you as a theorist. It gives you nice, simple answers to a lot of questions, but it means that there are a lot of answers that aren't available to you anymore. Whereas the dualist, I guess, might have access to similar stuff, similar answers, invoking the brain. Dualists can certainly invoke the brain in the explanation of the mind, but it feels like they're not quite as constrained in the same way. So yeah, I do think it matters.
Yeah. I guess I'll just make just one thought on this. Like, I suppose if you're a dualist, yeah, you're right. They're not maybe forced into certain answers in the way that a physicalist might be, or it's maybe a certain sort of physicalist. But still, I mean, you could have something to go on, like, especially if you think that there's these strong correlations or even like supervenience relations between the mind and so like maybe you can still infer stuff about mental kinds, even if they're not forced on you by in the way that, if you think that the mental stuff just is fixed by what's going on in the brain or something like that. That's
for sure. I mean, I am a physicalist.
Yeah, so am I.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I am a physicalist. It's interesting. I mean, it's an interesting question. When you say that things are a bit more open for the dualist, there's a few different views you might have on that, because you might think, so maybe quite a straightforward view would be, oh, well, dualism is more flexible. It gives you more options about exactly what the mind-brain relation is. But then, of course, the physicalist might say, well, that's not really fair, because the only reason dualism is more flexible is because they haven't spelled out what the relation is properly. They haven't given me a full theory. someone who's quite an extreme version of physicalism, an identity theorist, if they think consciousness, for example, just is identical with things in the brain, that does indeed constrain them a lot. There are a lot of answers they're forced into, but then that's what you'd expect, because they've given you a full theory of the relation, and they've spelled it out in really, really simple terms. Everyone believes in identity, and they've used that to explain the relation. So of course they're constrained, but that's just because they've given you more detail about what the relation is. Whereas there are lots and lots of different ways the dualist might try and spell it out, but every single option, like emergence, possibly some kind of supervenience relation, and people tie themselves up in knots with supervenience, don't they? Every one of those is going to come with an equal number of constraints. So for someone like me, I would say, overall, a very, very simple relation like identity. It's relatively extreme view, but you get this massive payoff, which is it's a very clear view of what the relationship between the mind and the brain is. And everyone has to believe in it anyway. Not everyone believes in emergence, but everyone accepts that stuff is the same thing as itself, so it feels, it gives you a lot. When I say that dualism's more flexible, that doesn't mean it's better.
Right, because it might be more flexible, as you say, because it just hasn't specified what the consequences are of the theory. And so there's more things compatible with it, perhaps.
I think David Lewis used to say, when he was talking about a rival to his view, he used to say, this is a view about which we're told so very little that incredulity can't even get a foothold. That's one way of getting philosophical respectability. It is not a good way.
Yeah, you could just give a lot of quizzical stares, I suppose.
Thank you.
So maybe at this point, if we could introduce the psychological natural kind principle, maybe I'll just... So according to that principle, if a kind is associated with a cluster of properties that is instantiated by its members, which co-occur non-accidentally, and the kind is useful for psychological prediction, explanation, generalization, and or discovery, then that kind is a psychological natural kind.
Yes.
So do you mind maybe breaking this down a little bit, explaining what this principle is saying?
What you're picking up on there is the version with all the caveats and criteria and all the many, many things you've got to add, because otherwise there'll be someone somewhere that says that. But
if you want to build it up from the more basic,
I mean, so here's the idea. So forget about psychological kinds for the moment, and think about the case of biology. So biology, one of the many things that biology does is it tries to break up organisms into kinds. It tries to classify different kinds of organisms. That is the same thing that every science tries to do. That it tries to classify stuff. Now, with biology, it categorizes things into species. It uses other categories as well, but species is one of them. So take an example like a polar bear. So what's all this talk of a cluster of properties? Well, imagine a polar bear. It's very likely to have certain properties. It's likely to have white fur. It will definitely be warm-blooded. It is likely to have 4 legs. It's likely to live in a certain environment. It's likely to have a certain, breeding strategy and all those kinds of things. So that's what it means to have a cluster of properties, is that members of this species, polar bear, all share quite similar properties across all the different polar bears share these properties. The first important caveat is that that's not exceptionless. So it is true that most polar bears are 4-legged, but one of them might be in an unfortunate accident. It might end up with only 3 legs, but it's still a polar bear. You don't need to have literally every single property that's characteristic of the kind. The other thing that's really important is that polar bears don't have those properties purely by coincidence. No, they inherited them basically. They inherited them from their parents. That's why there are these shared properties that all members of this kind, which is polar bear, share. And at its basis, that's what the view of psychological natural kinds that I've argued for says as well, is that for something to be a real part of the mind, a real part of the actual furniture, the metaphysics of the mind, for it to be a real thing in the mind, that not just something that we've made up, the faculty or the capacity or whatever it is, there needs to be a set of properties that are distinctive of that category. There needs to be certain properties which that category has, which members of that category tend to share. That's the idea. So, for example, long-term memory. There are certain characteristic properties of long-term memory which we know quite a lot about. We know that long-term memories, persist for a long time. That's kind of in the name, because they can last for minutes, seconds, or years. We know that stress interferes with it. We know quite a lot about how it's formed and how it comes about. In the same way that polar bears tend to all share this cluster of properties, they're all white fur, 4 legs, etc. Long-term memory, what makes something long-term memory is that it shares those properties as well. And that's the idea. That's the cluster of properties. That's the most important aspect of what a natural kind is, according to my view. The reason they matter so much is because if a category has that cluster, then it's useful for science and for philosophy in general, because it allows you to make generalizations. So if a kind is characterized, if all the members of a kind are characterized by common properties, you can make predictions and generalizations about them. So if you know that all members of, or not all, if you know that most members of the kind polar bear tend to have 4 legs and have white fur, you can make a generalization like, polar bears have white fur. That generalization is true. It's not exceptionless, but it's true. And you can make predictions as well. If you were to leave your house now and walk out on the street, if you were to see a polar bear, it would probably have white fur. We don't need to see the polar bear, because we know that if it's a polar bear, it will probably have white fur. So they're really quite powerful predictions you can make as a result of the fact that the members of this category all share a common set of properties. The shared common set of properties, the cluster, as philosophers call it, they also explain the sense in which these categories are not just made up. It's not like up to us. We can't just decide that what the properties that are characteristic of polar bears are. Those properties would be there and they would cluster together in that species, regardless of what our view was. We could have had different names for them, obviously. We could have called them something else, or we could have been completely and utterly unaware of them. Yeah, that could have happened. But there's nothing that humans, it's not made up. It's not just our convention that we see these properties as belonging together. No, they really do belong together. So in the polar bears, white fur, 4-leggedness, warm-bloodedness, etc., they all come and go in the same organisms. In long-term memory, our theories could be wrong about long-term memory. We can be mistaken. But ultimately, the fact that these properties are all co-occurring, that's not because of us. That's not convention. That's nature, which has caused that co-occurrence. And that's really the sense in which people sometimes say natural kinds are carving the world at the joints. What they mean is, no, it's because of the world. It's because of the structure of reality. It's because of the structure of the mind that these properties all come and go together. Not because we've made that up. Not because we've just decided that that's what we mean by the word long-term memory. It's not a decision on our part. It's something we've sort of discovered. And that's what makes them kind of so useful for science and for philosophy. How was that breaking down technical?
No, that's great. Yeah. And I did start with the sort of fully qualified version. Maybe we should have.
Yeah.
I should have. But yeah, no, that's great. And maybe it would be helpful to, well, first, I guess, contrast this sort of cluster view or cluster views in general from alternatives like a hard essentialist view about natural kinds, or something else. Like maybe what's the kind of key difference there, and why do you prefer a more cluster view like this?
Yeah, so essentialism is a very, very old view. Most people attribute it to Aristotle, but whenever you attribute anything to Aristotle, loads of people say, no, that's not what he thought. That's not really what he thought. So I have heard from reliable sources that Aristotle didn't actually hold this view, but the way it's generally thought is that essentialism is the view that what makes one kind different from another is a set of properties which are necessary and sufficient for that kind. So, for example, to use every philosopher's favorite example, to be a bachelor means that you have two properties. Well, many properties, but at least these two. You have to be unmarried and you have to be a man. All and only unmarried men are bachelors, according to a popular view. Now, that means if you fail to have just one of those properties, you cannot be a bachelor. And everything that has both of those properties is a bachelor. That's what essentialism is. It's that the things that qualify you to be a member of the kind, there's a set of properties. You've got to have all of them to be in the kind. And if you lack even one, you're out of the kind. The cluster view is different because... sorry, just to go back. Essentialism is quite plausible for some chemical kinds. So to be, what does it mean to be gold? Well, there's lots of characteristic properties of gold. It tends to be yellow. It tends to be malleable. It tends to be quite, I think it's quite ductile. It conducts electricity very well. That's true, but that's not what makes something gold. What makes something gold, according to the dominant view, is that it has atomic number 79. If something has atomic number 79, then it is gold. And if it doesn't, then it's not. And that's the only thing that really matters when it comes to whether something's gold or not. Now, the cluster view is quite similar to essentialism in the sense that it emphasizes the importance of properties, which have to be shared by members of the kind. But it recognizes that psychology and a lot of other disciplines are messy. So it might be the case that a kind... that there's a kind which is where members of the kind tend to have all these properties in common, like long-term memory. But if you found someone who had long-term memory but maybe just lacked one of those properties, that wouldn't mean that the person didn't have long-term memory. There can be exceptions. You allow a certain amount. It's much looser. It's possible for you to not have all of the properties but still be a member of the kind. So to go back to the earlier example, polar bears tend to have 4 legs. Yeah. They tend to have white fur. Yeah. That's all definitely true. White fur is a characteristic of polar bears. But if you shaved a polar bear, it wouldn't have white fur. But it's still a polar bear. It still gets to count because it doesn't have to have all the properties all the time. You're allowed to have exceptions to them.
Good. Yeah. And there seem to be at least some kinds that work that way. But I guess you want to allow that you can have natural kinds where it looks like something kind of essentialist-like is the right thing to say. Like there's necessary and sufficient conditions, and there's other clusters that associate with them, but they're not definitive of the kind or something like that.
Yeah, I think chemical elements might be a good... I mean, I'm not a philosopher of chemistry, obviously. So I don't know what a philosopher of chemistry would make of this, but I think the standard example is chemical elements. So you say, all and only examples of gold have atomic number 79, and that's absolutely strict. I think most people would accept that some essentialist kinds exist, but almost no one these days would say that biological or psychological kinds are like that. They're just the natural world is just far too messy, in my opinion.
Right. Yeah, actually, I did, as an aside, I did previously talk with Eric Sherry, and he does do the philosophy of chemistry stuff. And we talked about that a little bit, and his preferred sort of abstract characterization of chemical elements. And I think it's still amenable to something like that, but maybe it's a little bit more nuanced, but whatever.
Oh, is it? Can you remember how it's? That's quite interesting. Can you remember the nuances, or not to put you on the spot?
Yeah. Part of the idea was that certain characterizations of chemical elements, like, oh, it has this many protons or neutrons in the nucleus or something like that, doesn't really work. It's too simplified in certain cases because, well, we still want to say that it, say in a compound would still count as that element, but then like it might lose some of the attributes we assign to it, it's sort of individually. And really, I think the conclusion he wants to draw is that, I'm definitely forgetting some details and oversimplifying it, but the conclusion he wants to draw is that really we can give a sort of kind of more abstract characterization of what it is to be a certain element, where we can accommodate both it in elemental form and in compounds and in different sort of environments and something like that. I forget exactly how it went, but there was a sort of view there that was explored.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. Two of my friends, Robin Hendry and Francesca Belazzi, philosophers of chemistry, and I believe I think Robin's view of his view is that chemical compounds are not essentialist as well. I think his view is what counts as a chemical compound depends on the context. I think that I might have mischaracterized him, but I believe that's his view. So yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, but that sounds plausible. But I think either way, I think that the resulting account that he prefers is still kind of like you'll have roughly necessary sufficient conditions. Maybe not as strict as something just like saying atomic number 79, but well, it might be that atomic number 79 is itself associated with certain somewhat more complicated conditions. And maybe you could say something similar about some of these other, the quote unquote essentialist cases, like even with Bachelor, being an unmarried man, but like how much work is being done by those categories? Are those themselves precise, or are they clusters themselves? Yeah.
I just don't think bachelors are unmarried men. I just don't think the Pope's a bachelor. I think even that example is. I remember when I was a master's student, we were told to try and define bachelor, and we all said unmarried man. They said, "What about the Pope?" And then obviously people said, unmarried man who's got a sunny outlook on life and likes to go out on the town, and it just doesn't. It doesn't match up in the end with how the word bachelor is used at all. I think even the main examples of essentialist ones are often far more complicated than they look.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we can retreat to like geometric examples, or like mathematical examples, or something like that.
Oh yeah, that might be. Yeah, that might work. Like a circle is any two-dimensional figure with all points on its surface equidistant from its center in Euclidean geometry.
Right. Yeah, probably have to qualify that. Yeah. Yeah, that might work, but yeah. But anyway, yeah, and then we should maybe consider different sort of cluster views, because just saying that natural kinds, or many natural kinds anyway, are appropriately captured as some sort of property cluster in this way, that leaves open different views about what sort of property clusters and what more conditions maybe are required. So you mentioned the kind of three alternatives that you discuss a bit in the book. You can have a kind of more mechanistic or homeostatic property cluster view. There's a sort of simple causal cluster stuff. Viewers may recall, well, if they saw it, I previously talked with Muhammad Ali Khalidi about this, is a view that he endorses. And then or you can have these more stable property cluster views. But yeah, I mean, maybe do you mind sort of briefly introducing these views and how your approach differs? Or
yeah. So there are a lot of people who think property clusters matter loads. In fact, I'd say most philosophers working in this area recognize the importance of property clusters. But the difference tends to come down to why properties in a cluster have to cluster together. So in the old days, in the 1980s and 1990s, a view that was very popular. I mean, it's still very, very popular, but one view that gained a lot of traction was the homeostatic property cluster view. So it sounds really technical, but what it basically means is that natural kinds are they consist of things which share properties, but those things can't just share those properties purely by coincidence. Um, they have to share them because of some reason. And the HPC view, as it's almost universally known as, I call it the mechanistic view, because I think the word homeostatic's a little bit confusing. But this view basically says, no, they have to share properties because of a mechanism. There has to be some mechanism out there in nature which is forcing these properties to be shared. So with the polar bear example, why is it that imagine someone said to you, why is it that all polar bears have most polar bears I meet have white fur and 4 legs and they're warm-blooded? What a coincidence. The correct reply is, no, that's not a coincidence. They share them because of genetic inheritance. They inherited those traits. That's why they have all those traits. And it would be like, imagine someone who said like, oh wow, I've been studying long-term memory for years and it all shares all these properties. Everyone I meet, their long-term memory is the same. What a coincidence. No, it's not a coincidence. That's how their brain's wired up. Or maybe some other explanation, but there's a mechanism explaining why those properties tend to come and go together. That view, I think, is very plausible. The only problem with it is that it requires you to say what a mechanism is, and this has caused a lot of problems. This is philosophically is a very, very fertile and ripe area. No one's quite sure what it means for something to count as a mechanism in science. So you say, well, the properties, like a polar bear has to share those properties because of some mechanism. It's all very well to say, well, the mechanism is genetic inheritance. It has white fur, it's got warm blood because it inherited those traits from its parents. But then you start asking questions like, well, what actually counts as a mechanism? Is everything a mechanism? Presumably not everything's a mechanism, because then what couldn't count as having a mechanism, so I think that's the basic question. So people want to say, and I think correctly, I think they should want to say this, they want to say that these properties can't just be shared by coincidence. That's not what a natural kind is. They're shared because of some underlying reason. Some people say, well, there's got to be a mechanism, but then you have to spell out what mechanism is, and that's very, very difficult. There are philosophers who've tried to do it. Carl Craver and Linley Darden and lots of others have tried, but it's proved extremely difficult to spell out what a mechanism is. Phyllis Ilari, her work on this on mechanisms is really interesting. So some people like Muhammad Ali Khalidi, they've tried to say, look, okay, forget about mechanisms for now. The properties in the cluster just have to have causal relationships with one another. They have to cause each other, or there has to be something causing them. Just whatever it is, there's got to be a causal reason, because causation is a real phenomenon. Then that can explain why these properties cluster together. That kind of view, I think, my general picture of this whole debate is, I think my hunch is that from a natural kinds point of view, we've kind of lost sight of why this matters so much. So what we've seen is we look at these cases and we say these properties don't cluster together because of coincidence. They cluster together for some good reason. And then we've said, well, maybe it's a mechanism, or maybe it's causation, maybe it's causal. But then it's very easy to get wrapped up in knots, being like, well, what is a mechanism? What kind of causal relation? Are all of them like this? My opinion is that we have lost sight of the really important point. The really important point is that natural kinds are characterized by a set of properties which come and go together. That's what matters loads, is that members of the kind tend to share properties. and that happens not because of coincidence. I am quite resistant to spelling out to trying to say what it can't be coincidence. It needs to be this other thing. I'm quite happy to say, no, they just have to come and go together, and they have to do so just for some good reason. Just for anything that's not coincidence. That's all you need. You don't need to spell out what a mechanism is. It doesn't always have to be causal. You don't always have to have causal relations in there. If you say that, in my opinion, you're just asking for trouble, because you're just asking for someone to try and find a counterexample, like, well, over here there's one that's got these properties, but there's not a mechanism there. And no. In my view is that what matters is that properties co-occur, they come and go together, and that they do so for some reason other than coincidence. It can't, as long as it's not coincidence, I think that's basically fine. In the book, as you know, I spend a whole chapter trying to spell out what I mean by this, but I think what really matters is the cluster of properties, and I think we can get a little bit too hung up on the reasons why. I think that's of secondary importance, personally.
Good. Yeah, no, that's good. I guess someone could press though, like, okay, if it's non-accidental on one side, but on the other side, like, well, we don't have to specify that as something causal between the properties or a further mechanism. But like, is there another option? Like, or does it, like, is there really something sort of in between that it could be, or are you just saying it's something, but we haven't specified what it is or what it has to be?
Yes. Yeah. So, yes, you're quite right. So you've got two options so far. Spell out what it is, in strong metaphysical terms, or just say, I don't know what it is, but it better be something. Clearly, the second one doesn't feel right. Clearly that doesn't sound like a great theory. I'm quite inspired on this front by people like Matthew Slater. So what I would generally try and do is try and find a middle path. So the middle path doesn't try to give a metaphysical account of why they cluster together. It doesn't say there's got to be mechanisms or there's got to be causation, but it doesn't say nothing either. So it characterizes it more in terms of what you can do with the cluster. So you say things like, well, the properties cluster together if, when you have enough of them, that makes it reasonable to infer the presence of others. You can reliably infer from the fact that there's some of them to the fact that there's others. So, for example, if I said something like, what's the cluster? There's this thing in my garden, and well, it's got bark, it's got roots that extend really low down into the ground, and it's really tall. It's got branches. It's full of leaves. What are you going to say to that? If I told you I had that in my garden?
Maybe it's a tree.
It's a tree, exactly. Yeah, of course, it's a tree. And when you know that, you know that it's got those properties. Therefore, you can infer pretty much it's got to be a tree, surely. And that lets you infer loads of other properties. You then know, well, it'll be made of wood, won't it? It'll have xylem in it. It'll have phloem in it. That's what trees are like. So what's important for me is not so much that there's some strong metaphysical thing out there binding those properties together. It's that the presence of some of them lets you draw inferences about what the thing is, and then draw inferences about what other properties it has. So that's like the middle path between giving a big metaphysical theory of what the reason is and just saying, oh, it's something, but I don't know what it is. And that's the route that I generally go down.
Yeah, good. It sort of reminds me of like disputes when thinking about the laws and the philosophy of science. Like, we don't want our laws to be just like any sort of generalization, including accidental ones. But it's sort of hard to spell out exactly what it is that makes it a non-accidental one. And then people develop things like, best picture stuff or best systems or whatever. But I don't know. It still seems a little bit unclear to me, at least in this case, because like if there were some true like some things that actually did cluster in the world. There were like very few exceptions, or even no exceptions, to these things clustering together. And if we knew about that fact, we can even use that to make predictions and so on. But it seems that on the one hand, okay, maybe that would qualify in the sense as a natural kind cluster, but it still seems like it could just be some sort of accidental connection. Like maybe you see what I'm getting at. Maybe it feels, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think the analogy with laws is really, really good, because it basically, in the laws of nature literature, there's two massive ways you might go. Someone like Helen Beebe sometimes calls them governing and non-governing views. So you might think a law of nature is this metaphysical thingy out there in the world, which forces the world to behave. Whereas that's like an Armstrong kind of view. The best systems view that you mentioned is when you strip away all the really technical stuff, it basically says, well, a law is something that works really well for our scientific theories. And it's very complicated, the story of exactly the ways in which they're really good for our scientific theories. But broadly, that's the same difference. Is, when you come to natural kinds and you want to explain what underpins the cluster of properties, you can postulate a metaphysical thingy, or you can go the more theoretical route and say it's just what allows us to make good predictions and things like that. I guess what I would be inclined to say, it is certainly possible that you could get clusters of properties purely coincidentally. And yeah, that's right. That does feel like the wrong kind of thing to be a natural kind. I would say that those kinds of inferences you can make from some properties to others are unlikely to extend far into the future. So, like, it might be that here's an example. Imagine that purely by coincidence, for no reason at all, it just turned out that every football that had been made until this year just happened to be red. No one had ever decided to make them all red. Nothing. No. There's no reason for them all to be red. It just turns out that they were red. Like, you could then say, well, if something's a football, then it'll probably be red. But of course, if it's purely coincidence that those properties come and go, then there's no guarantee it'll still be that way tomorrow. That, there's nothing ensuring that those two properties are going to come and go together in the future. So I think those kinds of cases break down really, really quickly. Whereas if you have an inference like, if something's a polar bear, it'll probably have white fur, that's not just going to break down tomorrow. Assuming there's still polar bears around tomorrow, all the future cases we find, they are most likely going to have white fur. So that, I think that's the difference, is that the inferences, I like to characterize this in terms of, well, if you have enough of the properties, then you can infer the presence of others. And that's robust. It's something that's not going to break down. So that's the general picture I try and go for.
Yeah. I guess there's ways to press this further. I mean, I suppose we might worry that, okay, but how do we tell whether some property is sort of like projectable like this, or whether, how do we know it's a green light cluster versus a GRU light cluster? Is that based on other background knowledge that might be mechanistic or causal anyway, or is it,
I mean, if I could answer that, then I could solve the problem of induction.
True.
It's really difficult because, like, this is all about projectability and induction and inference and all this stuff. The problem of induction that you alluded to, it can be sometimes when you're working on this for years, like I've been, it can be difficult for you to see exactly what a theory of natural kinds has got to do. Presumably, it's not the job of a theory of natural kinds to solve the problem of induction. Presumably that's not what you have to do, because that's, tricky. I mean, unsolvable, arguably. So I guess with those cases, I would say that that's just the problem of induction, and it doesn't just apply to, property cluster views of kinds. Every philosopher with any view about anything has the problem of induction. So, but it's tricky. I think, still, I think a philosopher that really wants there to be some metaphysical thing grounding this inference, I think someone who really feels that strongly is unlikely ever to be convinced by a view like mine and like Matthew Slater's, which just tries to do it in terms of reliability and things like this. But it's certainly true that no one can solve the problems you were talking about.
Yeah. No, I guess I wasn't expecting you to, but yeah, I do see.
I wish I could.
Yeah.
I mean, some people. I think, didn't Karl Popper think he claimed to have solved it, didn't he? I think
Maybe.
Can't remember, but yeah, I can't remember.
Yeah, I don't know. Different people have claimed to, I think, but whether that's but I did want to ask, because I'm a big fan of issues concerning vagueness, and I was happy to see that like some discussion in the book, and so maybe we could talk a little bit about that. So you do think that natural kindhood can come in degrees, or sort of on a spectrum in some cases at least. Can you expand on that? Like, and in particular, can it be vague or even indeterminate whether something even counts as an instance of a particular natural kind, including for psychological kinds?
Yeah. Good. So there's vagueness. I think I'm really interested in vagueness. So the vagueness stuff, when it came to natural kinds, all started in the species debate again, because they realized that there were organisms that were kind of halfway between one species and the new one. So, you might find a fossil which looks to have some of the properties distinctive of the parent species, and some of them distinctive of the emergent species. So which one is it? I think most people are of the view, well, no, not everything has to be one thing or the other. Species categories can be vague, and that's something to be celebrated. That's just part of that's just what the world is like. In terms of how that actually works, basically, if you think a cluster of properties matters loads, then you've got a few different ways of thinking about it. You could say, well, if you lose 7 of the properties, then you're not a member of the kind anymore. And there's a sharp cutoff point. If you've got 8 of them, if you lose 6 of them, you still get to be a member of the kind. As soon as you lose the 7th, then you're not. And it's a sharp distinction between whether you're in the kind or not. I think that's wrong. I don't think you should think that way. I just think there's sets of properties out there. If you've got them all, you're definitely in the kind. If you've got none of them, then you're definitely not in the kind. But in between, there can be a big period of vagueness where it's not clear whether something's a member or not. That's what it means. So that's what it means for something to be in between being a member and not. So in the book, one of the things I'm really interested in is working memory. So which is a kind of short-term memory system which is located here, just above your eyes, in prefrontal areas of the cortex. And it's what you use for a lot of executive functions. It's for sort of sorting out things, tasks you're engaged in right now, holding things in mind, like trying to remember a phone number. That's all kind of classic working memory stuff. My view is that actually there's not a hard and sharp distinction between something being working memory and not being. There's actually a lot of different cases that can come in between, where you've got some of the properties distinctive of working memory and you're lacking others. In the same way that I think, you can have cases with biological species where they're not clearly a member and not clearly not a member. I think it's also possible there's like a gray zone in between something definitely being working memory and definitely not being, where there's actually quite a lot of different variations in how memory works. And you might have cases where there's some information and you say, well, is it in working memory or not? And the answer is there is no answer. It is in between definitely being in and definitely not being in. So that's how I try and develop it in the book.
Yeah, that seems right to me. Like, and you can say more details. Well, it has this features which are like part of the cluster in it, but it lacks these other ones, and it's sort of it's a kind of edge case, or maybe it leans one way or the other if it has a bit more of them and so on. But yeah, that seems like a reasonable thing to say to me. And
I just think anyone who says, well, these 4 properties, they're the important ones, or like, well, there's no one property that's more important than the others, but you need at least six of them. I just think they all those they feel a bit arbitrary, don't they? Like, well, the difference between one with six and one with five is only tiny, so why does that get to make the really big difference?
Yeah, I agree with that intuition. Of course, someone could press and as an epistemicist, maybe someone could try to say like, well, maybe we don't know where the boundary it is or why the boundary would be precisely there, but nevertheless, there is this precise boundary. And maybe in this case, it does come with the number or precise configuration of properties that they have. And I don't prefer a view like that, but that's someone could try that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm vaguely sympathetic to epistemicism. I know. So broadly, if viewers don't know, epistemicism is the view that there's always a clear line. Like, for example, there's an exact line between someone being bald and being non-bald. There's no vagueness there. It's just that we can't know what it is. Sometimes we just don't know what it is, and sometimes perhaps we can't ever know what the line is. I guess, like, not unlike most people, I don't think that's a silly, like, I think I can see why people hold that view for sure. Even though it's not particularly popular. But of course, I think the trick there is that they still do believe in vagueness. So they still do believe there are vague cases between someone being bald and non-bald. It's just they explain it in terms of our knowledge and what we do and don't know. So it epistemicism almost feels like a view, because it believes in such strong, precise boundaries. It feels like a view that doesn't really believe in vagueness. But of course, it's not. They do believe in vagueness. They just think that vagueness consists in our inability to find the boundaries. But I think, I don't know what your intuitions are on this, but with the old how many grains of sand before it's a heap, the idea there's a precise boundary there, I just find that is so difficult to accept. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think that like it has to be wrong. One of the examples that I like is the term noonish. Like if I say something's, oh, let's meet around noon. That's what we're meeting at. Like, is around noon or noonish? Like, is there like this many like Planck seconds after noon now is no longer noonish? Like, no, this is just a kind of term that we use kind of roughly in this sort of way, and it might vary a little bit by context, but you can talk about times sort of around noon that are noonish and so on. Is there going to be a precise boundary? Yeah. It just seems like the wrong result. That has, like, if there were to be a result like that, it seemed to me that it should fall out, or it should be a consequence of like the way we're using these terms and maybe certain facts about the environment or something that might, if that plays a role in fixing how the extension gets fixed. But like, it just doesn't look very plausible at all that something like this term and the way we use it and the environment and so on is going to fix anything like that.
I agree. I think vagueness. There might be some cases where there is a surprising precise boundary, but broadly speaking, my hunch is vagueness is a feature of language. And our words, like, language was not designed to be precise. Why would it be? Why bother? Why bother having such precise terminology? It doesn't seem to serve any function,
Yeah, and like in the biological case, or like this biological species case, like people will say, oh, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, okay, eggs predated chickens, but if we're talking about chickens versus chicken eggs, like, well, plausibly there wasn't a first chicken and there wasn't a first chicken egg, and then sort of like this, both of them lie on these sort of continua, I guess, and there's not really the one that came before the other when you look at the continua or when you look at the individuals. So I want to say neither in a sense.
There is a great and much overlooked, really cool, fun paper by Mohan Mathan called Chickens, Eggs and Speciation, which is the only philosophy paper I've ever found which is actually about whether the chicken or the egg came first. Because I always thought it was a pseudo problem. I always thought, no, philosophers don't really do that. But at least one does. And it's a really interesting, because of course, really what it's about is what species is and whether they have cutoffs and things like that. But I recommend if anyone can check it out. It's not, I've never come across, it's not a paper you see discussed all that much, but it's great fun.
Good. Okay, I did want to cover. You also cover one of the potential upshots of this sort of account where, well, we might be able to eliminate certain psychological kinds or terms. So, like, someone might think, well, hang on, if a psychological term doesn't pick out natural kind, or if it picks out a non-natural kind, then maybe we should eliminate that term from our psychological discourse. So what do you make of this? And then, like, what version of this sort of principle do you ultimately find plausible?
Yeah, I think so. In the book, I do, just to skip ahead slightly, I do think something broadly like that is true of vision. So I don't think vision is a natural kind. Um, so I think the term vision, or strictly speaking, the term visual episode, like experience of a visual experience, I don't I don't think that's a natural kind. I think that vision or visual episode, I think that's an umbrella term for lots of stuff that's actually really different from each other. So, an example might be organisms that have ever been been within 100 miles of Birmingham in the UK. That is not a proper category. It's going to capture loads and loads of organisms, but they're not going to be that similar to each other. It's a sort of made up umbrella term for stuff that's actually really different. People who are interested in natural kinds because they want to eliminate certain terms from psychology, they tend to think similar things about psychological faculties. So some people think this about emotions. They think all the different emotions are actually, that's just an umbrella term for loads of different kinds of processes. People like Elizabeth Irvine think it about consciousness. They think not a real thing, umbrella term for stuff that's actually really, really different. The idea is that if all these states, and if something's not a natural kind, it means that all these states, all these processes that we've been grouping together are actually not very similar to each other. They're actually really quite different. And they think that the general thought is, well, if they're really different from each other, then surely psychology has made a mistake in grouping them together, or neuroscience has made a mistake. It's grouping them together, it's saying they're similar, but they're not really that similar at all. So what we should do is we should be more precise. We should only group together the things that are actually similar, and we should exclude other things. And in order to do that, if we find out something's not a natural kind, that means those things are not really that similar, so we should eliminate the term that refers to them. So some people think we should eliminate emotion, the term emotion. We can talk about specific emotions, but the overall category of emotions is just too different. I'm a bit ambivalent about that. So I think that, because what you're basically saying is, if something's not a natural kind, we shouldn't even be talking about it. But the problem with that is, well, can't something be useful for psychology without being a natural kind? Like, why think that the only natural kinds are useful for psychology for reasons we talked about earlier, because they help you make generalizations and inductions and things, but they're not the only thing. Surely there's a way that other terms can be useful. So in one of my papers, I talk about cases where a certain term might be useful, not because the things it picks out are all the same, but because it's methodologically useful. The term is useful because it's associated with a certain methodology for studying the mind, and that's a really useful methodology. So that's my view of attention. So I don't think all the things we refer to as attention are actually a natural kind. They're not actually that similar to each other, I think. But attention research, the term is associated with a common methodology that is really useful, so we should keep the term. So very roughly what I think is, if something isn't a natural kind, yes. If something is not a natural kind, yeah, we should eliminate it, unless we spot something else that it's doing that's really good, or really useful for psychology, or really useful for neuroscience or philosophy. As long as it doesn't perform any good use at all, then yeah, there really is no point having that term in, and we should chop it. But I mean, changing scientific terminology sounds extreme when you say it. Like, people say, oh, emotions don't really exist, or concepts don't really exist. that's not really what you're saying. You're just saying, emotions do exist. It's just they're not actually very similar to each other. So we shouldn't be grouping them together. And I do find that quite plausible, that line of thought.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's not to say that isn't a real category. There is, or there isn't a thing that falls into that category. It's just that that category, or speaking in those terms, isn't relevant or useful for this sort of psychological or scientific theorizing or something like that, which is looking for more unifying categories or something that doesn't satisfy, something like that.
Yeah. I mean, just off the top of your head with emotions, it does sound quite plausible. When I say this to my students, they think, yeah, that sounds quite plausible. Is envy really that similar to anger? Is it really that similar to surprise or disgust? It's arguable whether they're even emotions, A lot of people think, no, well, whatever envy is looks quite different from like happiness. So it's not an extreme, it's not as extreme a view as some people, as it can easily look, I think.
Good. Yeah, and you've mentioned several of the kinds that you think, well, that are natural, psychological natural kinds, like long-term memory, and you mentioned a few other things. And you did mention a visual episode as a maybe surprising negative result, which I found interesting in the book. And we might think, well, wait a minute, but a visual episode, like, they all seem very similar to each other, at least in certain respects. Phenomenally, they're very. I mean, I guess you can have very different sorts of visual episodes, but being a visual episode anyway maybe seems very similar. So what do you think about this, and why do you think that it sort of fails to qualify as a natural kind?
Yeah, so I think the big negative result of the book is yes, that visual episodes aren't a natural kind. By that I mean like the experiences, the visual experiences themselves. Experience is a slightly dodgy word, but the things the visual system creates, the actual information carrying things, they're not a natural kind. I think a lot of it stems from the fact that from a first person point of view, it might feel like they are all quite similar. Like, I do get the idea that all visual episodes feel the same way. There's a sort of, to use fancy terminology, you might think there's a shared phenomenology to them. There's a consciousness character to them, which they all seem to share. But I think it's important to remember that vision is not just what you know about introspectively in your own consciousness. Vision is a massive, great big faculty that loads of your brain is dedicated to. And it includes lots of stuff that's going on unconsciously as well. So I think from our point of view, it's very natural to say, well, smells, I know I can spot a smell when I smell one. I can tell a visual experience apart from a sound or from an experience of touch or anything like that. And those things might all be quite similar, but actually, the data you're working with there to try and ascertain whether all of vision is a natural kind, the data you're working with from your own first person point of view is only the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more going on that's unconscious that you're not aware of. So in the book, I talk about certain kinds of processes which seem to happen unconsciously in what's called the dorsal visual stream. And broadly, the idea is when you take into account that vision also includes all that stuff, once you take into account how different all that stuff is, vision really does stop looking like a unified thing. It really does start looking much more like a hodgepodge of different faculties and different processes.
Right. No, that's great. I wonder, because I recently talked with Daniel Stoljar about his recent book on introspection, and I wonder, it's not something that I don't think it really comes up in the book as with respect to does it count as natural kind, but what about introspection itself? Because I'm sort of was thinking about it a little bit, and I was thinking maybe that would go the way of like attention and something like that, and it probably wouldn't qualify as a natural kind. But I don't know, is it something you thought about, or?
That's a really, really good question. My colleague, Maya Spener, has just written a book just called Introspection, where she talks about exactly this issue. So she thinks that the word introspection is actually a name for 3 different processes. You'd have to ask her for the exact details, but I believe there's introspection as a kind of mental ability to look inside our own minds and see what's there. There's introspection as a method, like as a way of finding out knowledge about your own mind. I can't remember what the third one is. I'm sorry. But yeah, she thinks that introspection actually breaks down into 3 distinct psychological kinds, which I'm already quite congenial to that kind of view. I quite like that view. So I would tend to agree with it. I have, for what it's worth, I have asked her whether she thinks it's not a natural kind as well. And she, I think she's, I think she's a bit reluctant to say one way or the other. I don't think she has a settled view on whether it's a natural kind, but she certainly thinks it breaks down into 3 different sorts of thing, for want of a better word. And I don't know much, but having read her book, I thought I agreed with it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, it's interesting, and I guess there's other cases like that we could potentially apply to as well. And some of them come up in the book, but of course we can't cover everything here.
Attention, I think.
Yeah.
Attention. I really think I think attention's made up of all sorts of different things, different processes. I think it's even more diverse than vision or introspection, in my opinion. But people in the attention literature don't agree with me. But that, that's what I think.
No, that seems plausible. But yeah, that's, as you say, you have another paper on that, and that's something that could be explored more. But yeah, so another thing that comes up sort of later in the book that's quite interesting has to do with, well, how can we apply this to consciousness in general, or in particular like infant consciousness? And you mentioned that there's like several issues with methodological concerns with studying infant consciousness, because like, especially when they're pre-linguistic, like they can't verbally report things, which is often a key sign of this, or that they can't really follow task instructions, and they don't have later on they don't develop memories of the states. Yeah. So with these sorts of concerns in mind, like how would you approach I guess investigating infant consciousness and sort of reasoning about it with respect to natural kinds?
Yeah, so here's the picture, and in my opinion, it's probably the most exciting aspect of natural kinds research, is that studying consciousness in adult humans is difficult enough. We don't really know whether we can trust introspection, all these things that are well known. But there are about 4 or 5 classic cases that are just especially difficult. How do you ascertain consciousness in non-human animals? How do you ascertain consciousness in an AI system? That's very current at the moment. How do you ascertain consciousness in someone who's in an outwardly unresponsive state? And how do you ascertain consciousness in babies and infants that can't talk? They can't report their experiences to you, so how do you do it? When you look at consciousness science that's carried out on adults, typically they would rely on the adult being able to tell you what they're conscious of. You clearly can't do that with a pre-linguistic infant. So what do we do, and what's natural kinds got to do with that? I sometimes feel like working on natural kinds, they can feel a bit technical and abstract in a way that they're actually quite a useful tool, is my thought. They're much more useful and applicable to concrete problems than they initially look. And here's the idea. Remember the tree example where I said, well, there's this thing in my garden, it's got bark, it's got leaves, etc. What's your immediate reaction? And you said, well, it's a tree. What you're doing there is there's a cluster of properties that come and go together. Bark, xylem, having roots, having leaves, being made of wood, blah, 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 blah. And you can use that to infer what the thing is, to infer another property of it, which is that it's a tree. Now, that's because there's a cluster of properties which allow you to, and you can infer the presence of some of them from the presence of others. What if consciousness is a property in one of those clusters? So if consciousness tends to come and go with, let's say, 4 other properties, that when these 4 other properties are here, that means you can infer the presence of consciousness, then that's great. You can then have a reasonable. You can then reason as follows. You can think, well, if consciousness comes and goes with these four other properties, then is a baby conscious of something? Well, if it has those four other properties, then yeah, probably it is. And if it doesn't, then no, probably it's not. So being able to verbally report something is a common feature of. It's one of the things in the cluster for adult humans, but it doesn't have to be. Like, people have conscious experiences that they don't report all the time. That's no issue. So verbal report, we know that does tend to come and go with consciousness, but not really very strongly. It's not actually very reliable. So the plan, what you try and do is you try and identify certain properties which are there when you start with adults, you take adults, you try and identify properties that are there when they're conscious of something, and which are not there when they're not conscious of something. You use that to write your big list of properties, which seem to come and go at the same time that consciousness does. And then you look at infants and you look at what age they develop those properties. And the age at which those properties come online, you say that's when consciousness emerges. Broadly, that's the idea. The reality is far more complicated and difficult than that. But at its basis, it's the same thing as the tree. It's the same thing as saying, well, these other properties are there, so consciousness must be too. The tree must be there too. That's the idea.
Yeah, good. But in like practice, how easy is this, or like what are the properties? Because you mentioned infants, but you also mentioned non-human animals and potentially like AI systems or robotic systems. Like what do we say about those cases, or are we just like, do we just not know enough about the kinds to make those sorts of inferences?
Practically, it's extremely difficult. I'll just stick with infants and babies because that's what I know about.
Sure.
The problem is this. So I'm fairly certain you're conscious. The problem is, you obviously, assuming you are conscious, which I'm pretty sure you are, obviously, you will have all the things you need, all the properties you need in order to bring consciousness online. You will have them right now. The problem is you'll probably have all sorts of other junk as well. You'll have all sorts of other properties because you have lots of other cognitive abilities as well. Lots more stuff has come online in your brain following the onset of consciousness. So the problem is when you're using adult humans, it's very, very difficult to tell apart the properties which are correlated with consciousness, because those are the ones that are in the cluster that you absolutely need to have in order to be conscious. It's very difficult to distinguish those properties from just other properties that you just happen to have because you've had all this extra kind of cognitive development. You've got the stuff you need for consciousness, but you've got loads of other stuff too. You've got loads of more advanced cognitive abilities as well. And it's very difficult to distinguish. Like, taking you as an example, what experiment could we do which would tell us, no, it's not those properties that matter for consciousness, it's these other ones? It's very hard because you are a case that has all of them. So what you find when you look at the research on this is that there's actually quite a few different candidate times that consciousness could come online. And they vary dramatically in the sort of vague time period that they give. There was a really nice paper on this by Claudia Passos Ferreira, where she identified 4 possible times, and there are more. That, there's different cognitive abilities come online at different times, and depending on which one you think is most indicative of consciousness, that's going to change when you think consciousness comes online. And that's the fun, is trying to solve that puzzle, and thereby work out when consciousness does come online.
Yeah, good. I suppose we could try to do some experiments on me. But even if there weren't methodological concerns, I suppose there would be some ethical ones.
I mean, there's things,
Yeah.
the way I phrased it sounds hopeless, but it's not. It's not an unsolvable problem, but there are things you can try and do to distinguish between them. But it's difficult. There's just so many different candidates for what could be the thing that causes consciousness. Some of them are behaviors, some of them are brain things, some of them come on very late, some of them are very, very early. It's very difficult to know.
Like if certain brain structures or brain processes are like either are or give rise to, or at least strongly correlated with certain conscious states or processes, then, well, in principle, maybe if we study those a bit more or get a better understanding of how those worked, and that could shed some light.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. I mean, there's two. I was going to say there's two main candidates. There's lots and lots of different brain things that people have pointed to as being the seat of consciousness. But the development of the thalamocortical network, that's something that happens quite early. A lot of people think that's important. I talk about the default mode network and its relationship to other networks in the brain. There's global workspace networks, which some people think are really, really important. They have a particular neural signature that I talk about. It's not hopeless. It's not like the problem I described is unsolvable. I think it will be solved. It's just that when adults have all these things at once, it's so difficult to get one on its own and say, well, what's it doing now it's on its own? Because they're not on their own. that brain structures are never on their own. It's hard to say. It's just tricky to say that's the one, not this one, but this one, that's the one that's doing consciousness. But we're making progress. It's just at the moment we have so many theories and so many suggestions, it's quite hard to pick your way through them.
Right, good. Yeah, I've had a few different guests on the channel that have discussed their suggestions. Like I had Paul Thagard on and Joseph Mendola and a couple others as well. But I do wonder when it comes to neuroscientific research and stuff like that. Also, I suppose psychological research. How do you think that could forward a study of psychological natural kinds? Like, what sort of stuff do you think is sort of ripe for future research, perhaps?
I think all of it. I think that the relationship between psychology, philosophy, and neuroscience is famously very difficult to pin down. But I think everyone sensible. Oh God, that's such a pompous thing to say. I think the vast majority of philosophers are open to the idea that, at least in principle, neuroscience is really important to understanding the mind. I think that's definitely true. I think understanding the mechanisms that underpin natural kinds is really important, because if you remember way back at the start of the conversation, I was saying, I don't think psychological natural kinds have to have a mechanism underpinning them in order to be natural kinds. But the fact is, a lot of them do have brain mechanisms underpinning them. In those cases, we should learn as much as we can about those mechanisms, because that matters loads. The other main example is the vision, the 2 chapters on vision that I have. A lot of the work in arguing that vision isn't a natural kind, or visual episodes aren't a natural kind, strictly speaking, a lot of that work comes from neuroscience, because as I said, a lot of visual experiences, a lot of visual episodes are not conscious. So we can't know about them from a first person point of view. But it's really quite extraordinary just how much we can know about them from the neuroscience of the brain and from psychology that studies behavior. And I think if you were to attempt to study natural kinds without involving neuroscience and psychology, I don't think you would make much progress. That doesn't mean that you have to be a reductionist. You don't have to say, oh, well, really, it's all just neuroscience. It's all just brain stuff. Psychology, in the end, psychology will disappear. There'll just be neuroscience in the end. and then we'll know what's really going on. I don't think that's very plausible either. But I just think that the more we learn about the brain, the more we're going to find out about the mind. But the inferences are never straightforward. It's never like this brain thing is happening, therefore this philosophical issue, the answer is X. It's never like that. There's always philosophy that needs to be done in between to draw philosophical conclusions from neuroscience. But I'm hopeful for the future. I think we'll resolve these problems. I don't know if I'll be around when we do, but I think we probably will, for sure.
Yeah, I imagine philosophers will be talking about this for centuries as it's come, at least. But hopefully along the way some progress.
The life of a philosopher is an interesting one for many reasons. One of them is that you spend your life working on things which you won't be alive to see the solution for. So when I remember that, it is always a moment of like, oh yeah,
No, good.
In the hope that it might be useful for someone in the future.
Hopefully, part of getting at that solution, even if it's a long ways away. Yeah, no, good. But then, so a couple of things just before we wrap up. What would you say is the main takeaway from this book, or what do you want people to get from this book? At least briefly stated. What do you think?
We are used to thinking of the mind as made up of different things, different faculties, different processes, different abilities. If we pay attention, it might sound a bit abstract or maybe even a bit dull to ask, how do we make those divisions? How do we chop them up into different processes? But actually, my view is, once you get clear on how that works, you'd be amazed how many problems in philosophy and in psychology now there's new perspectives on them, there's new ways of thinking about them, and you get something really like a theoretical result. You find out it's something new, a new idea, a new view, a new position, or a new way of looking at things. I think when you get clear on what you mean by these different processes, it's quite incredible what can follow, I think. Would you say that's fair, having read it?
No, I think that's very fair. Yeah. No, I like that. And okay, finally, I do like to end with a more general kind of meta philosophical question. Cool. What do you think is the value of philosophy? What makes philosophy worth doing? Perhaps more generally, or to you in particular, or what do you think? I know it's kind of a general question, but
oh no, I think it's a really good question. Can I give two answers, or do I have to pick one?
Sure. No, you can give two.
I'm quite concrete. I think so. I know that a lot of people think they're these questions are really, really valuable in and of themselves. I completely agree. Yeah, I think they are. But that's generally not why I do it. I think that thinking philosophically can help people in their everyday lives. And I think I see that from philosophy outreach programs like this, like your podcast. And I say outreach programs, I mean, public philosophy. I think it's proved very, very useful. But I also just think that science is really useful and philosophy is really, really important to help us do good science. I think philosophy's value goes well beyond that. But for the stuff I do, that's the main takeaway for me, is that it's a good philosophical outlook is all part and parcel of a good scientific outlook. So it's useful for those reasons.
Yeah, no, for sure. I definitely agree with that. Yeah, it's funny because I've asked this question a lot and I've got a lot of different answers, but a lot of different, similar answers too. And when it comes to me, I'm thinking like, yeah. So on both sides, like on one hand, a lot of philosophical issues and methods and so on, and questions that come up in philosophy are just interesting in their own right, and kind of want to think about them or try to figure them out and so on. Now, that's not to say that there are also other significance of them. Like a lot of these things have, Tim Williamson put it this way, the practical knock-on effects as well, which I think is another use of it. But yeah, one answer I got, just like when I had Frank Jackson on, one of the things he said, so why do I like to play tennis, right? It's like, I like to enjoy myself. It's something I like doing. And so part of the use of it or the value of it can be that. And the other thing you mentioned about having, developing or exercising certain methods or cognitive attributes and so on can be good as well.
Yeah.
Quite valuable.
Frank Jackson was always extremely talented at the punchy, memorable, convincing answer. He's very good at that kind of thing. Yeah.
But I think all that's kind of right, and maybe it's more you can say, but I guess how it relates to other fields. I mean, a lot of people want to think that you could just do science and just ignore philosophy altogether, but I forget it. I'm trying to remember who said it, but there's someone who said something to the effect of like, well, there's science. All scientists are on some level doing philosophy. Some of them just sort of recognize their philosophical assumptions that lead into their view and approach and methods and so on. And so I think it could be, maybe that's to talk about the practical effects as well. But
I mean,
not everything.
When you go back and read some scientific papers from, so for example, William James, his book, The Principles of Psychology, was it psychology or was it philosophy? You read it and it's just very obviously both. It's just very, well, I mean, but the book is, that was before we had this strict division, between the sciences, and, you can just see, the influence of both, and it can make the distinction between science and philosophy look a little bit artificial, I think.
Yeah, and also not that long ago I had Dan Nicholson on to talk about. He written a book on Erwin Schrödinger's short book on what is life, and ostensibly it looks like a scientific question, but it's a very philosophical work in a way, and the question as well. So like, and he uses it to argue for some sort of determinism and stuff, and so it's like ultimately it's a very philosophical thing, and oftentimes these things are not so easy to separate. And even in the cases where it looks like they're easily separable, it's maybe not completely. But anyway.
Yeah, for sure.
Anyway, good. No, I don't want to keep you all day. It's been really good talking. So thanks so much for coming on, Henry, and taking my questions and writing this book. And it's been excellent.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much for having me. It's been a pleasure. Cheers.